This is the Consciousness Podcast, and I'm your host, Stuart Preston. Each episode, I have a conversation with an expert in human consciousness. In this episode, I had the honor of speaking with cardiologist Dr. Pim van Lommel. For more than 20 years, Dr. van Lommel has studied near-death experiences in patients who survived a cardiac arrest. In 2001, he and his fellow researchers published a study on near-death experiences in the renowned medical journal, the Lancet. He then wrote the bestseller, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience in 2007. We had a great conversation and covered enhanced consciousness, NDEs, and much more. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. Pim van Lommel. Thank you so much for taking your time out to talk to me about consciousness. I'm really grateful for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So obviously you're known for your extensive work with near-death experiences, NDEs.
Yes.
Your book is titled Consciousness Beyond Life, and obviously this is a consciousness podcast, so I thought it was okay with you. We might kind of start there, talk a little bit about consciousness. And I know that medical doctors, cardiologists obviously included, generally see consciousness as either on or off, almost a binary state. In your first experience with a near-death experience in 1969, it seems like you saw consciousness differently, as more than just on or off, more than just a waking consciousness. Is that correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what you observed and what you learned?
Yeah, well, that was indeed in 1969. I just had my rotating internship, and it was the second coronary care unit in the Netherlands, because until 1967, all patients died due to cardiac arrest because modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and external chest compression were not yet possible. So it was all new for us. And in 1969, we had a patient who had a cardiac arrest, and we got him back after about 4 minutes. And we as the resuscitation team were, of course, very happy with it. It was all new for us. But the patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. And he told me about being a tunnel and a light and beautiful colors. And I always say I never forgot this event, but I didn't do anything with it. It was all new for me. I was young. I was doing my 5 years of specialization in cardiology. So, and I'd never heard about it as well. So it was all new. And I didn't know in that time that these kind of experiences were quite common and has been reported in all times, in all cultures, in all religions. It was all new for me. So it was only in 1986, when I read a book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow, that's the moment I started to be open and to ask patients about their, if they had any memories from a period of cardiac arrest. So only in 1986, I started my interest.
Okay. And so in looking at starting to discuss this with your patients, I guess from that first one, he seemed disappointed to come back. It seems to me like observing this, NDEs led you to believe that there is a special state of consciousness, if I have that right, that you call an enhanced consciousness?
Yes, that's right. So, and the challenge is,
No, sorry, go ahead. What is the challenge?
The challenge is that according to a current medical concept, it was impossible to report memories from the period of cardiac arrest, from the period of unconsciousness. So when I started to ask patients about their memories, possible memories from the period of unconsciousness, in 2 years out of 50 patients who survived cardiac arrest, 12 patients shared their NDE with me. And that was the moment that my scientific curiosity started to grow, because as I told you before, it should be impossible that people have memories and have an enhanced consciousness with the possibility of perception, cognition, memories, emotions, etc.
Because you know that when that's happening, the loss of blood pressure and the loss of glucose and blood, all that the brain shuts down. And so it would be impossible for them, especially the reports they come back with of observing things.
Yeah,
it would be impossible. So it's pretty clear to you that that's what's happening.
Yeah, so the brain stops functioning within seconds when you have cardiac arrest. So the clinical findings are that they lose consciousness when you measure the blood flow to the brain. the carotid arteries, it's zero within 1 second. So the body reflexes, function from the cortex of the brain, disappear. The brain stem reflexes, like the gag reflex, the corneal reflex, and the wider pupils, not reacting to light, these are all brain stem reflexes, disappear. And also the breathing center is close to the brain stem, disappear. So the clinical findings are that there is no function of the brain stem of the cortex at all. So, and when you measure an EEG in patients with induced cardiac arrest, we see that within 10 to 20 seconds, the EEG is flatlined as well. EEG is the electrical registration of electrical activity of the cortex.
Mm-hmm.
So the brain doesn't function at all.
And it doesn't function, and yet there's a reported consciousness. When they return, they report things going on that are clearly experiences that are conscious experiences that went on while their brain was shut down.
Exactly. And according to current materialist paradigm in science, especially neuroscience, is that consciousness is just a product of brain function. So when there is no brain function at all, it should be impossible to report conscious experiences.
So, and it's not just that they're conscious. There seems to be this new level of consciousness, I think, that you refer to as enhanced consciousness. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so what's the difference between normal waking consciousness and enhanced consciousness?
Enhanced consciousness, that has much more cognition, memories from early childhood. You have, when you have a life review, you relive your whole life instantaneously. So there seems to be no time and no place, no space in your memory. So you also remember from things in the past, and you are connected with the consciousness of others. And you know that each act, but also each word and each thought you ever had is kept and has influenced others as well as yourself. You also can have future events, and flash forward. So in this higher area of enhanced consciousness, there is no time and no space. Everything happens at the same time. When you focus to something or to somewhere, you will be there as well. So that's what we call non-locality. And people have a cardiac arrest of 2-3 minutes, and they can talk for weeks, days to weeks, about what happened during their NDE.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that does sound enhanced. Are there other ways, coming from the point of view of trying to understand consciousness, are there other ways to access that enhanced consciousness other than an NDE? Yes. Like maybe meditation or psychedelics, those kind of things?
Yes. There are many more possibilities to have an enhanced consciousness. But when you try to study the mind-brain relationship, and you try to understand how consciousness and the brain are related, then you should study the patient with cardiac arrest who survived cardiac arrest. But there are many more patients who can report an enhanced consciousness in meditation, in isolation, in existential crisis. So lost in the desert. Astronauts, Mitchell and Glenn, had the same experiences. Lindbergh had it when he flew alone over the ocean. So, but also just walking in nature can give the same experience as well. So you
can get access to that.
To die. And also people with in the terminal phase of illness can have this deathbed vision or end-of-life experiences, which also is the same kind of contact with enhanced consciousness. Okay.
The reason I asked about the psychedelics specifically is because it seems like throughout the book you mentioned that DMT, which in one section of the culture is referred to as a psychedelic, but it's really just a chemical that flows throughout the body. You mentioned that the DMT seems to play a role in consciousness. And so what role do you think that the DMT existing in our bodies already plays in our consciousness?
Well, DMT has a very short half-time. It means it disappears within seconds. So DMT in the body can hardly play a role. But in ayahuasca, there's two things, DMT and another thing from plants who make it the half time much longer. So people who use ayahuasca can sometimes experience a period of enhanced consciousness, but also have a chance to have hallucinations, negative experiences as well. So it's not always the same that you have the enhanced consciousness. But for me, like also psilocybin and LSD and DMT, give the possibility to break the connection between consciousness and the body and the brain. So the content,
and maybe for a little bit access that enhanced consciousness.
So exactly. So the content of due to DMT or LSD, but the content of the experience is due to the breaking the connection between consciousness and body brain.
Okay, well that makes sense. In your book, you mentioned that you are seeking to answer the question, quote, what is the biological basis of consciousness?
Exactly.
And within that, there's a pretty significant assumption that there actually is a biological basis, which you also point out has really never been proven. We all just kind of took this assumption and ran with it, when there really has not been any biological basis proven. So I don't know if you want to expand on that or tell us a little bit about, how would you answer that question today? If somebody said, what's the biological basis of consciousness? How would you answer that question today?
Yes. Well, I'm sure there's no biological basis of consciousness at all. So the role of the brain is not the brain has not a producing function, but a facilitating function to experience consciousness. So consciousness is, in my view, non-local, which means it is always everywhere beyond time and beyond space. And just a small part of this non-local consciousness is received as our waking consciousness.
Right.
And we send information from our body and from our senses toward consciousness. So the brain and the body can see it as a transmitter or interface. And I always try to, when I try to explain it, I compare non-local consciousness with the iCloud, with the 1 billion websites which you can receive all over the world, everywhere where you are. But this 1 billion websites are not produced by the computer, nor are parts of the computer. So the computer just makes it possible to receive it, but it doesn't produce it.
And so your computer has an IP address.
Yes.
And it's able to pull in these websites based on that IP address.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that like DNA happens to be our IP address for our consciousness.
Yes, that's a possibility. It's a hypothesis.
It's a possibility.
It's a possibility. So I think the interface function is not just in the brain, it's in the body, but it's also in each cell. So each cell has an interface function and is in contact with parts of this consciousness. It can be morphogenetic consciousness of other aspects of consciousness. But so consciousness is not in the body, not in the cell, but it is received by the cell and received by the body and by the brain.
Kind of a transceiver. And that's what you mentioned. I think if I recall this correctly, the book, like you have a piece of tissue from another person, sometimes it brings memories with it. Well,
that's the story about transplanted memories. There's people who have received an organ in an organ transplant, especially when you have received a heart or heart-lung transplant. Then you receive a living organ from the donor. The donor is not dead. Brain death is not death, because you cannot transplant dead organs. So the organ is a living organ. And this living organ, when it is transplanted, is still functioning as a receiver of the part of the consciousness of the deceased donor. And that gives rise to sometimes changes in feelings, character, etc.
Right. So if the brain does not create consciousness, where does consciousness originate from then? Is it something that like gravity that exists and has pretty much always existed? Yes. Or is there something that, when I was born, did something happen that developed a consciousness that connected to me, or what is the origin of this consciousness?
For me, there's no beginning, nor is there an end to consciousness. It has been there always and will there be always. And for me, consciousness is fundamental, which means everything comes from consciousness. The material world, our body, is formed by our consciousness. Our solar system is formed by consciousness. That also means that everything in the universe has part of this consciousness, or is connected with this consciousness, which is not to be compared with human consciousness, but with subjectivity of phenomenal consciousness. So it's always everywhere.
It's always everywhere. And that kind of ties into the quantum mechanics aspect of it. With quantum mechanics, we realize that everything is tied together. There's some coherence there in space. And you're saying that consciousness is essentially a fundamental part of that fabric.
Exactly. And I use quantum mechanics, quantum physics as an analogy, not as an explanation of consciousness.
Okay.
So the analogy
it's something similar to that.
Exactly. It is always connected, interconnected, beyond time, beyond space, and it's just always there.
And right now, we just don't know. We don't know exactly how it's connected. Again, going back to your analogy of gravity, right? We know we drop an apple, the apple falls from the tree and hits Newton on the head, but we can't actually look at a graviton, or we can't observe gravity itself. We can observe the effects of gravity.
Exactly. And that's what I also write in my book. So about gravitation, we know the physical effects of gravitation, but we cannot measure gravitational fields. And the same with consciousness. We can measure the activities in the brain as a result of consciousness, the physical aspects of consciousness with fMRI, PET scan, and CT and EEG. But we cannot measure consciousness itself because it is another higher dimension. And it's the same perhaps with gravitation. It's not in our physical dimension.
And that's kind of where we make a mistake. And sometimes we measure the fMRI or the EEG, and we just make the assumption that, I'm observing consciousness, as opposed to observing the effect of consciousness.
It's just neural correlates. We can measure changes in activity and changes in blood flow, but we cannot measure what we feel and what we think. We cannot measure the content of consciousness because it's subjectivity. And all our measurements in our physical world is trying to objectify and to measure and to duplicate findings, but we cannot measure, duplicate, or prove the subjectivity of our consciousness.
And I feel like I read that the brain is actually too limited in its size and scope and design. It's too limited to actually take on all of the potential memories that it could in a lifetime, and to even have this consciousness, which is obviously much bigger, could not really reside in this physical biological brain. That there's too much going on for it to actually handle. Is that correct?
Yes, because we know that when the brain stops, like in cardiac arrest, people have memories from early childhood. They can have many more memories, also feeling connected with the consciousness of other peoples in the past. And it is still at the moment that the brain doesn't function at all. And I describe in my book as well that there have been many other tests done that it is impossible to find any location of all memories. The brain plays a role in getting back our memories, but it's not stored in the brain.
And that's again where it's kind of functioning as that transceiver, the radio, where it's maybe the memories are within this electromagnetic field around the brain.
Exactly. It's always there in non-local consciousness.
Non-local consciousness.
That's it.
Speaking of non-local consciousness, I had a couple questions on that. The content of an NDE, this is what you said. the content of an NDE suggests that consciousness may be non-local. So when you talk about this non-local consciousness,
yeah.
what you're saying is that it's non-local to the physical biological brain.
From quantum physics, we know that non-locality means that there is information beyond time and beyond space, and always instantaneous, interconnected, so faster than the speed of light. And that's what we find in the reports of NDE as well. And also having access to the past and also to the future, to flash forward. That you see parts of the life that has to come is still there, because past and future is available in this higher dimension, higher realm.
So in this enhanced consciousness, this non-local consciousness, you have access to a greater amount of information. Past, future, all time and space is together, because there is no time essentially.
Exactly.
I don't know if you're familiar with it. Aldous Huxley, he has his book Doors of Perception, and he, in his experience with the psychedelic mescaline, he came back from that and said, "Oh my gosh, the brain is just a filter."
Yes.
To a greater consciousness. Is that analogous to the concept that you're telling me right now?
That's analogous, and William James has said the word filter already more than a century ago, in 1890. He mentioned the brain function as a filter. So it filters. Just a part of the non-local consciousness is received as waking consciousness, but there's much more in consciousness than we usually experience. The difference is when you have had an NDE, then you have the enhanced intuitive sensitivity, which means that your receiving capacity or the threshold of your consciousness has been changed. And you receive not only channel 1, your own consciousness, but also channel 2, 3, and 4 from consciousness of others. So you receive information not by your senses and not by your body. And you see future events as well, prognostic dreams. So you know that someone will die in weeks, and he dies. So you know someone is ill, and you know things that it's impossible to know. That's because you have the non-local connection with others as well.
And so when they come back from an NDE, do they still have some of these capabilities, or was it just that they kind of walked through a door, had access to it, and then they came back and the door closed again?
No, what I told you, there's a huge transformation in people who have had an NDE. And it is, 1, they lose the fear of death. 2, they have a new insight what is important in life. It's all about compassion, unconditional love. First towards yourself, accept your negative aspects, and then accept and have unconditional love for others and for nature, because they are connected with nature and they are connected with others. And NDE sometimes is called an experience of unity, an experience of oneness, because in the NDE you experience that everything is one, everything is connected. And the third aspect of transformation is enhanced intuitive sensitivity, that they receive information beyond time and beyond space. And that can be very disturbing as well, because you receive information
I bet.
you don't want.
Yeah, I bet. And so we mentioned that there are certain things, walking in nature, meditation, maybe some psychedelic isolation, that can actually provide access to this enhanced consciousness and then to collective consciousness.
Yes. So the name is not you can call it collective, you can call it universal consciousness, you can call it cosmic consciousness, it doesn't matter at all. It's all about the same.
We're talking about the same thing, okay. So is it with, like I had a conversation with Ed Kelly at the University of Virginia, who studies psi phenomena.
Wonderful guy.
Yeah, an amazing man. Wonderful guy.
Yeah.
Yes. Very honored to speak with him too. So this collective consciousness and access to that, does that help explain some of the things that he studies, as far as everything from telekinesis to shared memories to even reincarnation, some of those things? Do human beings have access through this collective consciousness to each other's consciousness without any physical interaction?
Yes, it's exactly. You can explain all these things with the concept of non-local consciousness and with the influence of consciousness of others, and also of in the material world, like psychokinesis. And we know that's an example is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, then you change the structure and function of your brain by changing your consciousness. What happens in meditation? What happens in mindfulness training? What happens in placebo effect? So when patients with Parkinson's disease or severe depression or with chronic pain receive a placebo, you see the same changes in the brain as when they have real medication. So it's all about changes in consciousness give rise to changes in the body, like neuroplasticity. And that's can call non-local perturbation of psychokinesis. I like the word non-local perturbation. That also remote viewing and non-local perception. It's all based on the non-locality of consciousness.
Okay. So in your view then, death, the end of the biological life, is really just a change in consciousness.
Yes.
From this filtered experience to the enhanced.
Yeah. I always say death, like birth, is a changing state of consciousness. Birth.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a little bit of a far out question related to this enhanced consciousness and the collective consciousness, and your hypothesis that maybe DNA is the link to one's waking local consciousness. If I could create a machine and I could give it my DNA address, my IP address, do you think I could transfer my consciousness to a mechanical brain?
No. I don't believe it.
And why not?
No. Because I think a machine is not the same as a living organism as we are. And when you put DNA somewhere in a machine, it's still a machine. So I don't believe the possibility.
So the essence would prevent that. Its essence would prevent that from happening. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think
well, thank you for accommodating my science fiction question.
I write also about that it is impossible that computers or other instruments will ever be able to produce consciousness.
Yeah, and there's so many people. I mean, you look at like Ray Kurzweil, who talks about the singularity and how close we are, maybe even 2045, to rebuilding our brain. And the one thing that always stops people when they talk about AI and recreating brains is, well, what about consciousness? And we can't even explain consciousness super well with ourselves, Chalmers' hard question of consciousness.
Exactly.
And so your explanations here, I felt maybe got me closer to thinking maybe that would be possible. But, I feel the same way you do, that the biology the essence would stop that from happening.
Roger Penrose has written about it as well.
Right. So and I think you did mention this in your book, but if not, then I pulled it in from some other place. But there's the study of the brain activity in rats.
Yeah.
When a cardiac arrest was induced with George Mashort and company. And if I understand it, that they put them under anesthesia and then they induced a cardiac arrest, and they noticed a high level of gamma activity and maybe even some theta activity in the brain right before or just right after cardiac arrest was induced. And then again, I think at the end when the rats were brought out of cardiac arrest. And I don't put forth this question as an argument for or against NDEs. My thought is, and if you already mentioned this, I apologize, but we should talk about it for the audience. This activity in the rats' brains, how do you interpret, assuming that you agree that the findings are accurate, how do you interpret that experiment?
Well, first, I don't remember how the rats were killed. I don't think it was an induced cardiac arrest, but they were decapitated, I think. So they were killed.
I thought they were.
Yeah, but I don't remember exactly. But what I know for sure, that this kind of activity has never been seen in patients who die. Also in cardiac arrest, when you have a cardiac arrest patient where there is an EEG registration, like an induced cardiac arrest, but also sometimes it happens during surgery when there is an EEG control and people have a cardiac arrest, then you see a flat line within 10 to 20 seconds, but you never see activity at all. So it has not been...
You don't see that burst of activity.
In humans. So I doubt the results, and I cannot put it into humans when you see it in rats. Whatever the disciples. I mean, and there has been an answer to this study written by Bruce Grayson and by me as well. It's just published somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I missed your response to that. That killed my hypothesis that I was running with the hypothesis that maybe that activity would be the disengaging of the consciousness from the body and then the re-engaging of the consciousness once they came out of the NDE. But if we don't even see that in humans, then that's moot.
It has never been seen in humans.
Yeah. All right. Then I just have a couple wrap-up questions with an open-ended one. So since writing the book, have you seen any new information or any recent discovery that has caused you either to reassess some of your ideas or that have reaffirmed your hypotheses on consciousness? Anything out there that has come along that made you take a second look at any of this?
Well, I'm reading and listening a lot to people and reading a lot of studies. And I think there are a prospective study in survivors of cardiac arrest, 344 patients, has been done also in UK by 2 studies and in the USA by 1 study. In total of 562 patients who survived cardiac arrest. And the findings were totally the same, which means there is no physiological explanation like anoxia of the brain, no psychological explanation like fear of death, no pharmacological explanation like the given medication. So there's no explanation at all why people should report a near-death experience. That's one. Another thing is that with our current materialistic science, we cannot tell anything about consciousness because it is beyond our materialist science. As I've told you before, we cannot measure, prove, duplicate, or falsify the subjective experiences we have. We can have the neural correlates, the activities and change of activities in the brain, but we cannot measure or prove what we see or think. So the main thing for me from the last 10 years is that we have to change science into the post-materialist science of all-inclusive science, which includes subjective experiences. And that's what's happening now, especially by consciousness studies.
And so you see that change in science, maybe even a change in attitude. You see that happening recently.
There's a Journal of Consciousness Studies, and about 10, 50 years ago, about 80% of the articles was about the materialist approach of consciousness. And nowadays it's about 30% materialist approach and 70% post-materialist approach about studies in consciousness. So it is changing. Yeah.
And with that change, maybe when we get to 51% or 60%, do you see any potential breakthroughs that could really shed some new light? Is there any? I know with, like in quantum physics, they're looking for the unified theory. And is there anything in your studies with NDEs or consciousness that you look to as, if we can get to this point, this breakthrough, this will really give us some better insight? Anything like that coming down the pike?
No, I don't think so. I think we learn a lot, and there's still a lot of discussion. That also in quantum physics, there's still the role of consciousness in quantum physics, that there is no objectivity at all, that the scientist who designs an experiment is part of the experiment, part of the result of the experiment, is still not accepted by a lot of quantum physicists. And so also the fact that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but the brain has a facilitating function, is still not accepted by a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers and psychologists. So for me, the main thing is that what has been found now should be more acknowledged and more spread out into the scientific world. I think scientists are far more reluctant to be open than the general population.
Yeah, they're a little more skeptical, but it's also just not good enough to say it's not true. There's got to be some further study and analysis and looking into it.
I think now we have facts enough to talk, to be sure that there is about non-local aspect of consciousness and brain is not produced. I think that's no discussion at all anymore because of all the studies that have been done. So I think the great challenge is that people will be more open for it. And what is striking for me as well, let's talk about, after-death communication, that people have mostly during night have contact with the consciousness of deceased relatives, which happens in Europe about 125 million people, and in USA more than 100 million people, but they're usually silent about it because they're reluctant to share it with others because they don't believe it or say it's just a dream.
Yeah.
I don't know if you
they
have
don't want to report
any contact with the consciousness of deceased relatives. Have you been in contact?
Yeah, it's tough for them. Even people that had some pretty significant experiences don't want to share it for the fear of that reaction.
Exactly. So, and also in the scientific community, I know professors who tell me in private, you could be right, but officially they say you are wrong. It's nonsense until they stop and retire, and then they say, well, perhaps he's right. So they're angry, they're afraid to lose their research money, research position at the university. And I understand it.
Yeah. All right. Well, what else do you want to share? Is there anything that I have not asked you in the context of consciousness, or anything else that you're looking at? Is there anything that I left out here that you'd like to share with us?
No, there are so many aspects. I think one of the aspects that are always very striking is the out-of-body experience, that people can tell what happened during the CPR or what happened during surgery, and all the details they tell us can be corroborated by doctors, nurses, and by family members. And it seems to be exactly what happens when they have seen when they were unconscious and had cardiac arrest. And there are many stories also, but in my book have been stories like the Denser case, where a patient 44 years old came in and the coronary care unit in deep coma without any circulation. He was already cold and blue, no heartbeat, no pupil reaction to light, no breathing. And then the first thing they tried to intubate the patient, but he seemed to have dentures in his mouth, so the nurse took out his dentures. And then he was another week in coma, was on artificial respiration on the ICU, and then at last when he regained consciousness, was back on the cardiac ward. And then he saw the nurse and said, you know where my dentures are. And he told the nurse exactly what had happened when he was brought into hospital. He could describe the resuscitation room where he was brought in coma and left in coma. He could describe the appearances of doctors and nurses involved in the CPR. He could describe the resuscitation room from a position above the body. So these are striking examples that consciousness with the possibility of perception happen when the body doesn't function at all, when the brain doesn't function at all.
Yeah, and you have some really good recounts of that in the book. I encourage everybody to get a copy of your book and read those. I don't remember her last name now, Pamela, the singer-songwriter who saw the instruments that were never visible to her.
But also blind people have been blind from birth, have had out-of-body experience with the first time they could perceive light and they could perceive things. And it was important. Even then people who are blind from birth don't dream in pictures. They don't see anything. But in cardiac arrest, they can perceive from out and above the body because it's not perceiving by your eyes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how do skeptics, when you tell this to a skeptic and say, a blind person was able to describe seeing the emergency room, what do skeptics say? I mean, did they just go, puh, that couldn't have happened and walk away, or did they have some other plausible explanation?
No, that's the best thing for them to do, walk away and don't discuss it, because when you really go into it, there's no other explanation that there really was perception out and above the lifeless body. The skeptics don't believe. and they don't know it, and they won't read articles about it. They just have an opinion what is prejudice, and they don't know the real facts. They don't know the scientific literature about near-death experiences at all.
Mm. Yeah, and that's just not good enough. Okay. Well, what else? Anything else you wanna share?
No, I think we have talked about the main aspects of the NDE research, and and I think the most important thing is that when people lose a close relative and had an after-death communication, then they know consciousness is still there. When you haven't had a near-death experience, there's no fear of death anymore, because there's a continuity of consciousness after the death of the body. So also for terminal care, palliative care, our ideas about death changed hugely when you have these kind of experiences, or want to listen with an open heart to this kind of experiences.
Yeah, so there's definitely some therapeutic benefits from people sharing their experiences.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, wonderful. Well, that was, it sure has made me think. So I have some new hypotheses of my own on consciousness. So I'm really glad that I read the book and watched some of your other videos and other material online. And I can't thank you enough for taking your time to talk to me today about all this, Dr. van Lommel.
You're welcome.
That concludes another edition of the Consciousness Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please find us at Facebook at facebook.com/The Consciousness Podcast, at our Twitter handle at Conchcast, and don't forget to subscribe to our feed at theconsciousnesspodcast.com. Thank you for listening.